You will take a look at the modern environmental movement, environmentalism in the post-World War II era. We want to examine the origins of modern environmentalism and understand trends in the debate over environmental policy. So when we look at this material, which really is focusing first on environmentalism in the United States, but when we look at it, we want to start with, what were the origins of the modern environmental movement? If you go to the United States of America, the origins go back in time. I mean, if you want the immediate origins, you go to the preservationists and the conservationists. Keep in mind the preservationists. These were the folks that, in reaction to really the Second Industrial Revolution, the growth of America into really the American West, and what they viewed as, the combination of the closing of the American frontier and the threat of this natural, pristine environment, the threat of this, environment being subjugated to industrial, exploitation, led preservationists to demand that parts of the American environment be set aside, to be untouched and left to, following generations in their entirety. And they were not really opposed, but, the other group that was operating at this time were the conservationists, so preservationists really led by John Muir. Conservationists, when we look at American history, we look at, Gifford Pinchot as like a leading conservationist voice, especially in the American government. And conservationists, they didn't necessarily want to keep nature untouched. They just wanted to conserve natural resources, so that future generations would have access to them and be able to use them for their needs. But the preservationists and the conservationists, they are the ones in the late 1900s or late 19th century, early 20th century that can be viewed as the immediate predecessors to the modern environmental movement. But even they had origins further back in time. You can go and look at the romantics, romanticism of the early 1800s to find an origin there, and you can continue going on back in time. But the preservationists and the conservationists, they left behind organizations and laws that would carry on their legacy. So, the preservationists, John Muir was instrumental in forming the Sierra Club that demanded the federal government, federal and state governments set aside territory to be protected in its, natural state. You had like the Audubon Society as well that, really focused more on birds, but, their laws, their actions, their organizations, setting aside lands for national parks, for example, they were the immediate forerunners. And they were still around when the environmental movement took off following World War II. Now, as far as, post-World War II events, what would be the one big event that sparked the modern environmental movement? Well, there I would say that we have to turn to the lady shown on the screen here, Rachel Carson. Rachel Carson was a pioneer in more ways than one. She was, first off, a female working in, the sciences and biology. She was what we would consider a marine biologist today. And keep in mind, 1940s and 50s, going into the early 60s, this was still a field that was dominated by men. Men usually controlled the institutions of higher learning. They were the ones that, determined who was allowed access to these repositories of knowledge and who was not. They controlled the journals of science. They controlled the debating halls, the government. And so they were the ones that said, who was going to be taken seriously and who wasn't. And here you have Rachel Carson, who's challenging this, male-dominated field, when she locks on to this theory that she puts forth in her book Silent Spring, which is today all of her science is recognized as solid, as 100%. But she's the one that that came out and presented this novel idea that these chemical compounds that we were releasing into the environment, like DDT, which was a powdery substance used as an insecticide to control mosquitoes and malaria. Uh, she's the one that said that these are these persistent organic pesticides that once released into the environment, they don't go away. They go into our water table. They go into, they lace our vegetables, and then not only do we consume them, but animals do as well. And that was the whole purpose behind the title of her book, Silent Spring. She looked around and said, where are all the birds? Where's all the animal life that we used to see, in our neighborhoods around us? And the culprit that she determined was DDT. And initially, her book was rejected by the male-dominated scientific community. It was, summarily dismissed, but it found a ready audience. And one of the influential figures that latched onto her book and accepted it and promoted it was none other than, President John F. Kennedy. And so as more of these, figures, used these influential figures caught on to her book and, accepted its premise and began to promote it, her ideas, really took off. And so today when we say, who would be the pioneer, who's the figure that we lift up as a giant that our modern environmentalists, whose shoulders our modern environmentalists stand on, it'd be this the scientist right here, Rachel Carson. So 1960s and 70s, this was a time of, movements for change overall. And what will happen is, with Rachel Carson's publication of this book and its growing popularity, is it's going to be, absorbed by many of these other movements that are out there, and they're operating and they're pushing for change. So in politics, for example, this is the beginning of the New Left, as we call it, pioneered by the Students for a Democratic Society. In their Port Huron statement, they came out and basically said that, America was living this middle-class lifestyle, that they were basically being geared by society to produce money and to produce, goods and to consume goods, in that they were allowing themselves to be led into this new political standoff between the U.S. and the USSR that was, threatened, human life with nuclear weapons, and they rejected it. And so they called for, an end to the Cold War, an end to, hounding, socialists and leftists, and instead, embracing socialists and capitalists and everybody in an effort to recreate the world as they knew it. They rejected this consumerist first, lifestyle, if you will. And keep in mind, though, that we recognize today that the New Left and SDS, that was populated mostly by kids that were coming out of, upper middle class and affluent lifestyle. The realities that they faced on a day-to-day basis was very different from the realities faced by, poor whites, and definitely different from the reality faced on a day-to-day basis by people of color within American society. But, when we look at the counterculture movement of the 1960s and Woodstock and, the hippies and stuff, this is one of the organizations that's behind all that, behind the anti-war rallies. And they're going to embrace, environmentalism as, not the main element of their movement, but as, kind of a part of this larger vision for a future. If we take a look at the civil rights movement, when you have guys like Medgar Evers and Malcolm X and Huey Newton and Martin Luther King Jr., Fannie Mae Hamer, and others, out there pushing for African American rights to vote and to an end to segregation. Many of these these activists are going to evolve in what they see as needed for minority communities. So Martin Luther King Jr., for example, eventually expands his idea to say, okay, we don't just simply need the right to vote. We don't just simply need the right to go sit at a lunch counter and order dinner. There's got to be some sort of economic equality as well. Without it, how do we exercise our political rights? How do we make life meaningful? And so what will eventually happen is that people will start to realize that to promote equality within minority communities, it also means to promote environmental equality. So there's a great book out there, Environmental Inequalities by Andrew Hurley, that takes a look at Gary, Indiana, from 1940 to 1980, and he looks at how usually within literature we become so fixated on this kind of capitalism, environmentalism dichotomy that we forget about looking at the subtleties of what's happening with the environment and pollution and capitalism. And when we go down into the subtleties, what we begin to realize is that not everybody experiences the environment the same way or pollution the same way. So in his case of his study of Gary, Indiana, what he realized, what he discovered was that, people being exposed to, the slag deposits, the tar runoffs, the particulate pollution, many different chemical compounds released in the fumes from these smokestacks. Not everybody was exposed to them differently. Middle class management, in their workspaces as well as in their living spaces, were able to get away from the worst of the contaminants, as were the affluent of Gary, Indiana. Whereas the ethnic communities, whereas African American communities and Latino communities living in Gary, Indiana, they were the ones that usually had to live closest to the factory, closest to the pollution. And if there was some sort of spillage in terms of chemicals or what have you, usually they were going to be the ones that were going to get hit directly and have their lives upended by it. And we really see this, especially even in say COVID, 19, with COVID-19, the fact that usually communities that are going to be exposed most to environmental changes, whether it's the release of a new pathogen or the appearance of a new pathogen, or whether it's pollution, is usually going to be those people that do not have the financial means to escape it. So we see this in COVID-19. We saw it in Hurricane Katrina, just many instances, in the 2000s and the new millennium. So coming out of these movements, what will happen is there will be, you have organizations like Sierra Club and the Audubon already out there, but they're considered like the establishment communities. They want scenic parks. They want to protect birds. The new groups that are coming out of this are going to adopt much of the militancy, many of the tactics of the counterculture and the civil rights movement. In some cases, they're going to take harsher tactics and apply them to environmentalism. So 1971, for example, you have Greenpeace, which becomes a major front runner of the environmental movement. Greenpeace today, what do they do? They go out and they'll dangle off of a bridge to obstruct, river traffic. They will go out there and try to stop whaling vessels, all sorts of, kind of radical movements, as well as the day-to-day movements of administering a big organization and getting new followers and getting their message out. You'll have PETA, People for the Ethical Treatment of Animals in 1980, stopping, experimentation in labs, for example, and some of their more radical followers, what will they do is they'll try to go in there and release, some of these animals being held in captivity. 1980, you get the Earth First movement, the idea of, taking direct action when it comes to stopping environmental pollution. So, spiking trees to prevent, lumber companies from going in there and harvesting, forest lands. Outright monkey wrenching, going in and, sabotaging equipment for industries that they, extractive industries that they view as destructive. This was, some of their main tools. And then you'll have even some of the extremists engaging in eco-terrorism, so lighting fires, outright destruction if necessary. Now, while this is happening at kind of the grassroots level, you do have federal action occurring in the United States of America, following the publication of Silent Spring, that is of significant consequence. A lot of them were significant coming in the 1970s. So the Environmental Protection Agency was established, and there is actually some that can kind of predate this that you can lump in there, like some of the nuclear testing ban treaties, but they weren't necessarily, if you take a look at, like, say, the test ban treaties that were signed under, Kennedy and then later signed again and again. These weren't treaties that were actually established with the environment in mind. But keep in mind, one of the biggest sources of pollution following World War II was nuclear testing. If you take a look at the American testing alone in the Bikini Atoll, I mean, those islands today are contaminated to the point that Bikini Islanders still have yet to fully be able to return back to their native homes. They actually erased an island in the atoll when they detonated a hydrogen bomb above Inuiatok. And that's just America, in the Pacific. That's not, the French in the Pacific included. That's not including the many nuclear tests that the Soviets were detonating in their republics and then later using to turn into reservoirs for drinking water. It doesn't include the testing that was done in the American Southwest. But, all this testing, it's not just simply irradiating the immediate vicinity, but it was actually releasing strontium-99 into the air. These byproducts of nuclear explosions that, are persistent. So, we can include, like, these nuclear test treaties, nuclear test ban treaties as part of this overall legislation that benefited the environment, but I wouldn't even call it necessarily environmental legislation. So environmental legislation, we can look at the creation of the Environmental Protection Agency, the EPA, that actually administers and enforces environmental law in the United States even today. You have the Clean Air Act, Clean Water Act. Today, these are two pieces of legislation that are fundamental when it comes to stopping pollution, because they actually give the federal government the ability to monitor and to set limits and then to go in and enforce. You had the Federal Environmental Pesticide Control Act that set into the process of who's able to produce, to be certified for transport, what can be transported, how can be transported, how pesticides have to be labeled. 1972, the EPA banned DDT, almost 10 years after Carson published Silent Spring. And then in 1980, Superfund was created, the Comprehensive Environmental Response Compensation Liability Act, which basically created a revolving fund whereby states can go in the event of a severe environmental contamination like what we had at, say, the Love Canal incident. And they can go and they can borrow from this fund, clean up the mess, but then they have to pay it back so that it's there for future generations. That was an important piece of legislation in reversing a lot of the damage that was created. So there's all this legislation, but at the same time, keep in mind we're still creating new national parks at the same time. You have like the National Park Service that will go into their holdings and their lands, and they'll try to reverse any environmental degradation that had occurred. So there's a lot going on here during the 1970s and 80s. And what's important to note also is during the 70s, This isn't a time period. The Democratic Party is going to be the one that's going to associate itself and adopt environmentalism as part of its platform. 1970s, while the Democrats controlled Congress, in terms of the presidency, this is the period where, if it's not Nixon, it's Ford, with Carter being really the only Democratic president in office, and that was at the very tail end of the 70s. So you actually have an administration that realizes that it doesn't really have much of a choice but to go along with, a Republican administration that doesn't, realizes it doesn't really have much of a choice. It's got to go along with this legislation that's being passed. This will change in the 1980s, though, when the Reagan administration will take a more resistant approach to enforcing environmental policy. But then it'll go back to pro-environmental policy under Clinton, with Bush. So since the 70s, it's been kind of this back and forth. Usually Republicans in office, Republicans controlling Congress. We'll see a push back against environmental legislation. Democrats in, we'll see a push for it. Now, internationally, the international community has been increasingly lending its weight behind the environmental movement as well since World War II. One good example of some of the early steps to conserving and protecting the environment, we can look at the formation of the International Whaling Commission in 1946. Countries started realizing that they were killing off the whales, and so they created the IWC as a way of limiting whale hunting. And today, there's a big push not to just simply limit and regulate whale hunting, but to outright get rid of it if possible, and to repopulate these important species in our oceans. Following Rachel Carson, going into the 1970s, the theory, the science behind global warming started appearing increasingly, not only in scientific textbooks, but also in day-to-day American and global conversation. We started to realize that all the burning of fossil fuels and coal and gas, or petroleum, was leading to byproducts that were creating greenhouse gases that were trapping heat and causing, this increase in global temperatures that was going to have a negative effect on life in this planet. And not just simply global warming, but also beginning to realize that some of the chemicals, just like Rachel Carson discovered, but some of these chemicals that we were releasing weren't going away, and they were having other bad effects. So a good example of this is CFCs, chlorofluorocarbons. CFCs were the main gases used in refrigeration and air conditioning. And what we started to realize by the 1980s is that these CFCs, they didn't go away either. And keep in mind, refrigeration, it starts in the late 1800s, like in the United States with Gustavus Swift, using refrigerated cars, but usually it was blocks of ice were a main form of keeping things cool. Increasingly after World War II, we're going to turn to gases, and we're going to turn to machines that use these gases to trap heat and absorb heat in these gases, and then to transfer that heat from a building or from an enclosed space to the outside through a condensing unit, and that these gases were, eating away at the ozone. And so all this science is out there, but keep in mind that while the science is growing, everybody's not just simply going out and accepting it. Rachel Carson, for example, DDT manufacturers, went after her, viciously. We saw this with smoking campaigns when we started to try to, stop people from smoking in public. What happened is the tobacco industry, kicked up its kicked up its efforts to maintain this public image that smoking wasn't bad for you. And so for the longest time, we'd hear these reports in America about how smoking could relax you and how it was perfectly healthy and it actually did great things for you. Of course, realize now that a lot of these scientists were actually paid by tobacco companies to say this. During the 1970s, following the OPEC oil embargo, one of the things that happens as we start to discuss and debate in American politics about our energy dependence abroad are some of the side effects and alternatives to petroleum. We start to know from our science in the 1970s that, first off, burning, petroleum as a fossil fuel was, highly polluting. We started to realize in the 1970s that our oil reserves globally were finite, that it wasn't an inexhaustible supply, that sooner or later it would run out. And we also began to realize that, yes, we did have the technology that could potentially replace it, as early as the 1970s. So you start seeing your very first electric cars in the 1970s. But what happened was that you had this massive pushback by petroleum companies, and once again, what they start doing is paying scientists to promote pro-fossil fuel legislation. So there was a big pushback. So even today, when you look at the debate over global warming in the United States, it's universally accepted that the science is there. Yes, we do increase the temperature of the Earth. Now, we can debate about the minutia of the general concept and how we arrive at our conclusions, but it's unmistakable. It's like saying the ocean is blue. I mean, it's, you can't really deny it. But even today, people will still outright reject global warming. But nonetheless, the international community as a whole leaned more in favor of making moves towards limiting our impact on the environment. So, again, a lot of stuff's happening in terms of just like some of the big things that I can point to and say, here's an example. You can start with the Montreal Protocol of 1987. And the Montreal Protocol really took a look at, our atmosphere. So one of the things that it did is it banned chlorofluorocarbons on a global scale. So by the the 1990s, for example, mid to late 1990s, could you still get CFC? I think it was 137 for like your car air conditioner. The answer is yes. You could, but it's going to cost you well over $100, and that's that was not cheap in the 90s. But most of the air conditioning units had transitioned to R22 by that point, which is a persistent gas in the environment, but at least it doesn't eat away at the ozone. But today, whereas there was this major outcry when government started accepting the Montreal Protocol that it was going to be the end of the economy as we knew it, today we don't even use R22 anymore. I mean, even that has been set aside in favor of other less less persistent gases. So, we're starting to realize that no, just because you pass this legislation that says we're going to protect the environment, it doesn't mean economic collapse as we know it. It means, opportunity for new industry. So Montreal Protocol, was a major step in the 80s. United Nations Framework on Climate Change in 1992 set up the groundwork, if you will, for major international agreements on reversing climate change. So the first big one was the Kyoto Protocol of 1997. In the Kyoto Protocol was a commitment by developed countries to reduce greenhouse gases. But keep in mind, not all countries committed to the Kyoto Protocol. The United States was a big holdout. Canada later, reversed direction and got out of the Kyoto. And it wasn't binding necessarily. It was really just a commitment to. But still a big step that you had all these developed countries willing to come out and say, yes, we're going to take steps to reverse the damages that we've caused. The big one, though, was the Paris Agreement of 2015. The Paris Agreement of 2015 was different from Kyoto in that it was actually binding. So this was a true blue treaty. Now, again, it wasn't perfect. It's the one that's in place today. A lot of countries signing on to it, but there are some problems with it. One of the big problems is that countries can get out of it. There is a mechanism for countries to back out, and this is what happened with the United States of America after the election of 2016. The Obama administration that signed on to it got the United States in it, but then Trump administration came and they said, nope, we're out. And then 2020 election came around. And then what happened? Well, the Biden administration came in with a commitment to once again get the United States back into it. And so, this is a big problem with the Paris Agreement, is that it's, kind of turning out to be a revolving door in the case of the United States of America, which is a country that produces a significant amount of greenhouse gases annually. So the the modern environmental movement, we see that it's, international in scope. So we're moving beyond just simply, countries working independently. We've seen a lot of federal legislation in the United States of America being passed that commits the federal government to limiting pollution. Its origins were in the 1960s and the 1970s with the New Left and the Civil Rights Movement, and new organizations coming out to replace the organizations that emerged from the preservationists and the conservationists. And of course, today we can't talk modern environmentalism without taking our hats off and salute this wonderful person, Rachel Carson, who not only challenged the gendered normities of her time, but provided the scientific a scientific example to follow when it comes to studying the natural world around us.